Dr. Aaron Benavot is a doctor, master on psychology by the Stanford University. He has been research professor in different colleges at international level, like the Columbia College, Georgia University, Hiroshima, and Albany University. Currently, he is entitled professor at the Albany University. He is also supervisor of global education for all of us. He has developing policies and written more than 15 papers for lifelong learning issues. Give him a hand.
Buenas tardes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Very good. I think I'm going to walk around a little bit. I learned something from my colleague Helen that we've been working together for many years. It's good to get up and walk around as you're making a presentation. And I would like to begin by motivating a little bit how my talk maybe differs from the previous talk. And I'd like to talk, first of all, to begin with this issue of what do I mean by adult learning and education. So the important distinction that I'm trying to make here is that in using the term adult learning and education, I'm referring to a very broad universe of education and learning, both formal and non-formal, that is not specifically reduced to the notion of adult literacy or the ability to speak so many words per minute or to develop automaticity and various kinds of skills that are needed, whether they be reading skills or numeracy skills or decoding various kinds of symbols. And maybe one of the ways for me to ensure that we can see this broader universe is to take a moment to look at all the flags that I have behind me and ask, in the minds of those who are looking at these flags, as we also saw in the morning during the ritual, there are all kinds of emotions and identities that emerge from listening to the national hymn, or saying the Pledge of Allegiance of a country, or looking at a group of flags that represent a region. There are issues and identities of social solidarity, a sense of regional identity, a sense of cooperation. These are social and emotional learning and attitudes and values that cannot be reduced to whether or not you can read or numerate at a particular level. Or take a look at the flowers that we have here on the stage. Look at the colors. Look at the way that they are organized. Something about your education, either as young people or perhaps even as adults, leads you to look at this floral arrangement and to say, this is aesthetically pleasing, or it's plastic, and therefore I find it abhorrent, because it doesn't So there are a lot of different ways in which visual stimuli are introduced into our lives, that a lot of learning goes on. Learning that is informal, learning that goes on in the family, learning that is also formalized in various kinds of non-formal frameworks. And it is this broader universe of learning and adult education that I'm really concerned about. So in the title, it isn't about adult literacy or basic education. It is this broader sense of the kinds of opportunities, the opportunities for learning that young people, youth, and adults have across their lifetime, and the extent to which they are made visible. Because the other part of my title is to say, in many ways, much of the learning that occurs is unnoticed, is not seen, or at least it is not, there are no accounts of it. We have a difficult way of being able to capture it, to give it numbers, to somehow aggregated at the level of the community, or at the level of a country, or at the level of the world, which is partly the level that I'll be speaking from. So part of the interest that I have in my presentation is to argue, how can we make this broader universe of learning and education that occurs all over the place, and much of it is either undervalued or invisible, and how can we make it more visible and in some sense more valuable or valued by those that may not think of it as being valuable. So in some sense, that's really the motivation behind my presentation today. And the reason that colleagues have asked me to speak is because I had the great privilege of working at UNESCO for 7 years on a team that produces a very special report. It used to be known as the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, and more recently it has changed its name to the Global Education Monitoring Report. I had the privilege of working as a senior analyst on this team for 4 years between 2005 and 2009. And between 2014 and last year, I was the director of the team. What is special, by the way, this report comes out in Spanish. It is downloadable free of charge. It is also available in all the international languages. It is a wonderful resource in part because it is developed by an independent team that synthesizes research from around the world, including here from Latin America and the Caribbean regions, in ways, in ways that would be understandable and accessible to those who are not necessarily academics or researchers, or those who might have a PhD in some social science discipline. So I invite you to, first of all, take a look at some of the volumes. In particular, I think this volume here, called Literacy for Life, from 2006, which focused specifically on adult literacy and adult learning, would be of interest to many of the people here in the auditorium. And the volume that ends this first series in 2015, and then the more recent volumes, in particular the one from 2016, that looks at the new agenda at the global level, the international policy agenda around sustainability and sustainable development. Again, there's an enormous amount of material in Spanish, which I think you would find both accessible and quite interesting. So it is because of the role that I have played in working with an independent team at UNESCO that looked at educational issues from a global perspective that I think I can say something about adult education and lifelong learning. I am not an adult educator. I have not worked in the area of lifelong learning, but I have been a teacher for many, many years and a professor of students in many universities and in many other places. So in that sense, I guess I also am an adult educator. But I have not been part of the adult education community, but I have much sympathy, which, by the way, is another interesting, let's say, adult skill, empathy, sympathy, that one does not necessarily gather. In other words, hearing the stories of your grandparents who may have left from difficult circumstances and who wish to be heard and wish you to have empathy and sympathy over the circumstances of your life is not something that is necessarily mediated by your ability to speak and write and read a language. But it's, again, skills that adults acquire that have enormous value and importance. Okay, in part, by keeping with this idea that it's important to repeat in order for all of us to learn, I'm going to kind of outline my main argument at the very beginning and then return to it at the end of my presentation. So my argument goes as follows. First of all, relative to other areas in the education sector, something I certainly don't have to tell people that are sitting in the audience, progress in adult literacy in adult basic education and other opportunities with respect to lifelong learning has languished, has been relatively weak in terms of the progress that it's been able to make over the last 2 to 3 decades in many countries that we have gathered evidence around. It is not being prioritized in most ministries of education. It is not allocated funds by most of the major donors at the international level. And it has had very little sustained investment by corporations in the private sector. And yet, there are many social and political trends that call out very explicitly for increased investment in adult education and various kinds of lifelong learning. Moreover, as I will show you, in the newest 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that 193 countries, including Mexico, committed themselves to 2 years ago in September 2015 at the UN, there are very clear commitments that countries have made to improve opportunities for lifelong learning and for adult education. They are embedded in the global goal on education, but they are also found in many of the other sustainable development goals. So in terms of the international commitments that countries have made, adult education and lifelong learning should actually be on the front burner of the agenda of many of these countries, and yet it is not. But as I have had from the experience of working on the Global Education Monitoring Report, we have seen that given the little progress that has been made over the last 15 years, I am not especially optimistic that in the next 15 years we will be able to accomplish or achieve or make significant progress with respect to the new set of targets that countries have agreed to for 2030. I'm trying to be very clear about what my argumentation is. The reasons for this are many, but I would argue that one of the key reasons for the potential lack of progress is the lack of visibility. The fact that much of adult education occurs but is not being seen by the people who make decisions about education and the allocation of funds and resources to adult education. So we have very poor accounts. We have very little information that enables us to both understand what kinds of adult education and lifelong learning opportunities are available and how they compare from one context to another. And indeed, there's a dearth of systematic information about adult learning and education. The current information that we do have tells a very incomplete picture. It gives us a little bit of information on the edges, even, let's say, with respect to the idea of adult literacy. But if we think of adult learning and education in these broad terms, in this broader universe that I'm trying to portray here, we have very little systematic, comprehensive information about lifelong learning opportunities or adult education at the national levels. And by comprehensive, I do not necessarily mean comparable. So I think that it would be beneficial and perhaps enormously important to first be able to portray within the context of each country a fairly comprehensive profile of the kinds of adult education and lifelong learning that occur without being too concerned at the beginning as to how it might be comparable or compared from one context to another. In my view, if something is not done to rectify the current situation, and quite soon, we will find ourselves in the year 2030 lamenting once again how little progress was made with respect to adult education and lifelong learning. So the time to act is now and not tomorrow. and not in another 2 years or 5 years. The time to act collectively to change this current state of affairs, in my view, is now. And with this in mind, what I would like to propose at the end of my presentation is a very modest proposal about potentially how we might overcome this invisibility of adult learning and education that I see when I look at the landscape and the horizon. So that, in a nutshell, is my presentation. Hopefully you'll remember it now. We'll come back and it'll be in your working memory or your other, we'll figure it out. All right, so a little bit of historical perspective. The main part of adult education that the international community was interested in, and this was mainly the educational community, not the development community, was trying to reduce rates of adult illiteracy by 50% between the year 2000 and 2015. And in fact, we made very little progress. The EFA goal number 4 was perhaps the goal in which the least progress was made of the 6 EFA goals. So the numbers of countries that were actually able to reduce their illiteracy rates by 50% between the year 2000 and the year 2015 only was about half of all the countries. Many of them made less progress, many made no progress at all. And indeed, when we look at the total number of adults that are considered to be low-skilled or illiterate, and this is based on extremely problematic means of aggregating information about literacy, the numbers, as we've heard, are approximately 750 million adults in the world. That's a little bit like about 20%, as it were. And the proportion of women has not changed during this entire 15-year period. 2/3 of all the illiterates in the world in 2000 were women. 2/3 of all the illiterates in the world in the year 2015 were also women. So this is both an issue of illiteracy, but it's also an issue of gender, very specifically with respect to adult literacy. In fact, in our estimates, half of all the adult women in sub-Saharan Africa were denied the basic right to literacy. And this is fairly devastating, given the kind of commitment. This was a very specific target. This was not a grandiose target. This was a very specific target, and yet progress on this very particular target was minimal. There are examples of countries that made significant progress during this 15-year period. Here are some that we mentioned in the 2015 report, including the fact that Mexico used a lot of mother tongue language materials in order to assist and expand the kinds of opportunities to adult women and adult men in Mexico, and other various kinds of policy initiatives that we talked about, from Kenya that used direct assessments of literacy, to issues around mass literacy campaigns that occurred in Nepal, to making sure that literacy is also relevant to the lives of the learners, as we mentioned in Cameroon, talking about farmer field schools or other ways in which farming techniques and literacy rates were intertwined in the kinds of programs. So there were areas of success, but looking at the big picture, the global picture, the success was very uneven and nothing matching the kind of success that occurred in terms of formal education and in some of the other areas. And so here you have this, as it were, this kind of juxtaposition on the one hand of many broad social and political trends that call out for greater investment in adult education and lifelong learning, and on the other hand, very little attention to it. So some of these things have been mentioned by my colleagues. For example, people are living longer and generating more demand for various kinds of learning throughout their lives. There are all kinds of new technologies and growing automation, and people are shifting productions which impacts the kinds of skills that are needed by workers and changes their career trajectories, and that they need various kinds of reskilling. National populations in many parts of the world are growing more diverse, partly due to the intensification of migration trends, all of which highlights the need for new approaches for social integration and social solidarity at the national level, or even at the community level. Adults are expected to become more resilient to the effects of climate change, extreme weather, and natural disasters. This is not something that you can easily teach or that you would only want to teach in school, but rather this is something that demands attention by youth and adults. And finally, we've also seen a huge increase in the number of refugees and displaced peoples who have, around which or for which there's an enormous demand to provide some kind of education in a particular language that they understand during this period that they are replaced, that they're seeking asylum, that they're experiencing the status of a refugee. And if you look at the data from UNHCR, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the periods of the amount of time that refugees are spending as refugees is actually increasing. So trying to find educational programs and interventions, both for young people but also for adults, is becoming an especially salient issue. And as I have mentioned in my initial argumentation, this new agenda that all countries in the world have agreed to, that replaced the Millennium Development Goals, took on a very broad educational agenda. In many ways, the new Sustainable Development Goals have embraced and expanded the EFA agenda, and they have made it a much broader lifelong learning agenda than had existed anywhere in the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals did not speak about adult education, they did not speak about lifelong learning, they did not speak about early childhood education, they didn't speak about higher education, they didn't speak about technical vocational education. None of those aspects of education were included in the international policy priorities in the year 2000. All of them are included in the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have in front of us the most expansive agenda that we have ever, as an international community, agreed upon with respect to all forms of education in the broadest sense, formal, non-formal, and informal. And specifically under SDG 4, there are 3 targets, let's see here, that speak about adults very clearly. Target 4.6 that talks about literacy and numeracy skills among youth and adults. Skills for employment, decent work, and entrepreneurship, target 4.4. Access to higher education, technical vocational education, and participation in adult education, which is under target 4.3. And perhaps one of the most revolutionary targets, which I wish to come back to, is target 4.7 that speaks about all very central moral and humanistic concepts that have been embedded in international covenants ever since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which this year we're celebrating its 70th anniversary, issues to do with international understanding, with gender equality, with multiculturalism, and in particular with respect for education for sustainable development and global citizenship. These are not, by the way, areas that are necessarily aligned with one's reading skills or one's numeracy skills. It would be very difficult to make a claim that one only can make progress and advance with respect to the sense of global citizenship and the kind of sustainability attitudes and skills that are needed only by learning how to read and write. And the same would be true for issues to do with gender equality or with international understanding. It's important also to keep in mind that almost every other sustainable development goal, here I've mentioned 5 of them, apart from SDG 4, also includes targets or language that instantiates, that makes reference to various kinds of education, thinking of education again in the broadest terms. So we have a target around health and well-being that speaks about access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including family planning, information, and education, and the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. We have an indicator for gender equality, which talks about the laws and regulations that guarantee women between the ages of 15 and 49 access to sexual and reproductive health care, information, and education. We have a target around decent work and economic growth, which talks about the proportion of young people who are not employed or being trained or in some kind of formal education system. We have a target that talks about responsible consumption and production that ensures that people everywhere have relevant information and awareness. How do you gain awareness if not through education? For sustainable development and lifestyles in harmony with nature. And we have an enormously important target on climate change to improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity as climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. So to make the point clear, the impact or the reference to education in the new Sustainable Development Agenda is not simply in this very comprehensive, very expanded set of priorities under SDG 4. Education, either explicitly or implicitly, is integrated in almost every single SDG, which is another way of saying that if we do not make progress on education in the broadest sense, that we will undermine the kind of progress that we wish to make on the broader Sustainable Development Agenda. Which is another way of saying that if we wait, if the only solution to climate change mitigation or to many of the other issues is by educating young people today, that means we have to wait another 20 years or 30 years before they take on positions of power and authority in order to change policies that would solve some of the problems that we face today. That would be an unmitigated disaster. So it's clear that given the urgency of many of the issues that are outlined in the Sustainable Development Agenda, that the only way forward, or the most efficient way forward, is through educating, in the broadest sense, adults, through various kinds of lifelong learning opportunities. So it's there, wherever you look, very clear. These are commitments that every country has made. Now you could argue, the representatives of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs that sat in New York, that they signed their name to this document, had no intention of translating that national commitment to practices on the ground. And that would be true of a lot of countries. But we as educators, we as concerned citizens, we as members of civil society organizations, we as journalists, can hold our governments to account for the commitments that they have made in our name. And we should. We wrote a whole report about accountability in education that just came out a few months ago. And it speaks about the enormous important role that we as citizens, as communities, as NGOs, in our various public and private capacities, need to undertake actions that hold our governments to account, in the same way that we wanted our governments to uphold the key principles of human rights that they signed to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years ago. It's exactly the same idea. So we have a responsibility to hold our governments, however lackadaisical or that they didn't really intend to carry out the things they committed to. And it clearly goes through education. without trying to, I think my colleagues here have done good service in part, but certainly you can see this in the reports, that there's an accumulation of evidence that indicates how much learning in school and throughout the life course can stimulate those aspects that are fundamental for a kind of more sustainable future, that bring about greater green growth, changing skill acquisitions, reducing inequalities, generating more open polities, increasing the sense of social inclusion, and promoting environmental sustainability. If you go to our 2016 report, every single sustainable development goal was covered in a particular chapter in which we mobilized and synthesized a huge amount of evidence that speaks precisely to these issues. So don't take it from me that I'm, kind of fallen off the stage here and think that this is something that I've imagined. It's based on a lot of hard work by many people over a long period of time, a sustained period of time, to synthesize research that speaks precisely to these kinds of relationships. And the other point, which I'm sure that my colleague from UNESCO's Institute for Lifelong Learning will speak to tomorrow, is that indeed the last couple of years have been very formidable in other ways in which international educators or representatives of governments and ministries of education have come together and agreed to, although these are more normative instruments than anything else, but they've agreed to a series of statements and declarations that put adult learning and lifelong learning kind of at the forefront. And these include, for example, the Global Alliance on Literacy, the Conferentia, the International Conferences on Adult Education. I've already spoken about the Agenda for Sustainable Development, a new recommendation on adult learning and education, and the Global Report on Adult Learning and Education that I also was involved in part. So we have a lot more, let's call them international normative platforms, again, that we can use in order to mobilize governments, funding, and other kinds of community work. All right. I'm not going to go through the definitions here because I think that this is quite clear, that there are workable definitions around what we mean by lifelong learning, adult education. They're fairly broad, and they're meant to provide a platform for countries in their specific context to see what kinds of adult education are instantiated through these kinds of definitions. It's important, as I've indicated time and again, to think of education in the broadest sense of formal, non-formal, and informal. And as many people have indicated through their questions, probably the most challenging part of this tripartite scheme is with respect to this non-formal education. And if I might just stop here for a moment, in my personal view, and I've written a little bit about this, one of the things that is problematic for a lot of adult educators is to often use the terminology from the formal system and to basically say, well, it's the lack of those things in the formal system that, that characterizes the non-formal system. And I would argue that there are a distinctive set of attributes and characteristics that characterize what non-formal educational frameworks are all about. Some of them have been mentioned here. Symmetrical relations between the learner and the educator, issues of trial and error, issues of trying to speak to the learner's motivation. There are people who have spoken about this, but I don't think that in our teacher training programs we speak sufficiently about how educators have conceptualized the idiosyncratic elements of non-formal education and not just see them in the shadow of what goes on in the formal system. And I think that's one of our challenges going forward. In the report, we put together a kind of a schema that indicated these three dimensions, the formal, the non-formal, and the informal, as a way of perhaps capturing many of the different activities that occur over the lifespan, and to maybe find ways to classify them, because most of the classification efforts have been done at this level, the ISCA levels. We have many fewer efforts that have been done in classifying the various kinds of non-formal educational activities, and certainly with trying to make some account of informal educational activities. So here is my best rendition of what kinds of instruments have been developed at the national, the regional, and at the international level to give some account to some aspect of adult education and lifelong learning. So you can see that particular countries have developed various kinds of instruments to account for certain kinds of activities. We see this mainly in Europe, in the global north. We have found very little evidence of kind of systematic accounts of this kind in many other parts of the world. We have a lot of descriptive, sometimes comparative case studies of adult learning and education that are much more qualitative, that are very important, but often are very difficult to compare from one case to another. We have some regional evidence, both at the OECD level and some instruments that have been developed that are direct assessments of literacy. Again, each of these instruments provide a very partial picture of the broader accounting that we would like to be able to provide about this enormously important area of education and lifelong learning. At the global level, the fact of the matter is that we have very imprecise and highly problematic instruments. So for this one issue of adult literacy, we have been using subjective assessments of heads of household. We've been using the years of schooling that people have completed as a proxy for whether or not they've achieved literacy. We have asked the individuals themselves in census schedules. We've done lots of things than simply assess, can they read and write? Can they read a sentence and such things? And by the way, UNESCO here dropped the ball very early on. This was something that it was under UNESCO's mandate beginning in the 1950s. This was part of a series of very important priorities that UNESCO was given after it came into existence, and here they dropped the ball. For all kinds of maybe political and other reasons, it was under UNESCO's watch that we have such imprecise and problematic estimates of adult literacy and numeracy. And we do have some other international agencies that have put together some other evidence around ICT skills, digital skills, and we have the monitoring survey that UIL carries out that is a bit problematic, partly because it's very difficult to validate and get a sense of how reliable the information is that is being provided by the governments. Certainly UIL has gone out of its way to increase the number of countries that participate in this survey, that provide some answers, some of which we saw in the presentation this morning. But the point that I wish to make is that all the instruments that we currently have available have a lot of limitations. And if we wish to provide if we want to capture this broader arena of adult education and lifelong learning, most of the current instruments are highly limited in terms of their value. They give us very partial information about adult education and lifelong learning, especially non-formal. The global coverage is very problematic, so we've seen from some of the things that I've mentioned here, we have a lot of information in Europe, we have some information in Latin America, but apart from these two regions, we have very little information even at the regional level. It's very difficult to validate and to get information from non-governmental sources which is very important because much of the non-formal education is actually outside of the government purview. We almost have no information about changes over time, so we get a lot of pictures about a single time point and not how they change over time. And certainly, in short, it's almost impossible to construct some kind of pool of national profiles of adult learning and education or lifelong learning opportunities at the global level. Certainly, we have lamented that fact in the report very clearly. Why do we have so little information about adult education and learning? This would be a very important question to ask. I give you some possible explanations. I think they vary from country to country, from region to region. Certainly one of the reasons is that adult education is voluntary. It cannot be mandated by government or by government officials. Adult motivations to participate in adult education and learning are diverse and multiple and change, as we've seen, as they age and grow and mature. So making provision policies to meet those demands is very difficult because they need to accentuate some of these differences. Adult education programs are enormously diverse because of all the different providers and the places in which they occur. And teaching adults is certainly more challenging than teaching children, partly because when you teach children, they're forced into a classroom, into schools that you have some kind of control over. But adults have multiple commitments to their families, to their workplaces, to their communities, and so whatever learning that they may be engaged in, it is not necessarily the central part of their lives, and therefore it makes their commitments much more difficult. We also know that if we think about who is engaged in adult education in most countries, it isn't necessarily the Ministry of Education. There are many other ministries that are involved in adult education. It could be the Ministry of Health. It could be the Ministry of Women and Young Children, of Social Welfare. It could be the Ministry of Labor. So how do you develop an inter-ministerial coordination mechanism that allows you to capture participation in various kinds of adult education and non-formal learning across many different ministries? This is not a simple matter. Governments appear to be reluctant to fund adult education. They prefer to divest. As one person once told me, ministers rarely lose sleep over the number of adults who are participating in adult education programs. They are much more concerned about being able to say to their constituents in their party or to others that they owe their allegiance to, see how many more children we have brought into school. See how we've been able to increase the enrollment rates. These are things that they can show very clear progress over a short period of time. It takes time for people to become literate or to gain these kinds of skills which are not being measured that adults gain. How would a minister be able to demonstrate this kind of progress which is not so easily demonstrated? And as we've seen, the provision is much less standardized and is not easily captured in the kinds of categories that we presently have available. What we would like to know is a comprehensive overview of all the different kinds of adult learning education that occur, that would include what are the different definitions that are being used at the community level, at the urban level, at the city level, the municipal level, at the regional level, or at the national level. What kinds of regulations and laws and other policies are in place at these different levels? What kind of funding is being made available? What kinds of resources are being allocated? Who is participating? Is adult education essentially supporting the education of middle-class adults and those who already have high levels of education, or is it being targeted to those who have been marginalized by historically by the education system in the country for language reasons, for ethnic reasons, for reasons to do with their location and their residence, or their gender for that matter. We'd like to know information about the quality of programs, about the quality of the providers, of the kinds of frameworks in which they learn. We want to know those who begin and those who actually complete a program. We would like to know some of the outcomes. This is, by the way, not the only thing we want to know. We don't only want to know, have they gained the skills, have they changed their attitudes, have they changed their behavior. But it is important to know that also. So one of the reasons that I'm putting all these things up here is to indicate that outcomes are important, but they aren't the only thing that we would want to measure or to somehow give an account of. But we would like to have a much broader picture, and it would include all these items. Now you might say, Dr. Benavot's living in a fantasy world, right? What I'm asking to do is actually impossible, right? It's like impossible. There's no way that we could ever get this kind of information, this comprehensive sets of information from so many different countries in the world. And you're probably right that I'm living in a little bit of a fantasy world. But here's a proposal, a very modest one, that maybe it's a way forward. And partly the idea is, first of all, as I've indicated, we would like to have information at many different levels. Not just the national level, but the regional level, and especially, I think, the municipal level, where a lot of dynamic adult education and learning occurs. So here's my proposal. I think what we need to do is do a little bit of crowdsourcing for the kind of information that we want. We need to mobilize people in many different stakeholders who are involved in adult education. This would include the educators themselves. It would include the policymakers. This would include teachers. This would include academics. It would include non-governmental organizations. It would include religious organizations. It would include everyone who might have a stake in adult education. They should be given the opportunity to provide information, both qualitative and quantitative, to a kind of a digital platform, kind of a Wikipedia of adult learning and education, that it would take a few years to create it. But in the end, after maybe 5 years or so, we might be able to have a much more comprehensive view of the provision and the kinds of outcomes of adult education programs around the world. And eventually we might be able to do some comparisons. Now, in order to make this happen, I would argue that we need to do two things. First, we need to develop a bit of a template, some sense of what are the different sorts of information that we would invite people to provide. What are the things, what are the kinds of things that we're interested in? It's a little bit like this list here that I generated, but it could be a little bit different. And it would certainly also speak to this issue of the different levels. So it would not necessarily only be national levels, it could even be at the program level. So you would want to develop a fairly flexible, and perhaps that would be where the comparison would come in to say, we'd like to know, the kinds of funding that's available for this kind of program, whatever it may be. So you would develop a template, and then as streams of information were to be submitted, you would also want this information to be vetted. You would want to have some series of experts or others who might be more informed, or at least could be able to distinguish information that would seem to be fake or problematic or highly skewed from information that seems to be more valid. So I would say that through this kind of a process and over some period of time, we would slowly but surely and perhaps systematically build up a kind of a global platform of information that eventually could be compared across contexts around adult education and lifelong learning. And I don't think that it would be as expensive as it might seem. One would need to kind of get some initial seed funding at the beginning. But I think that it would help, which is the argument that I started with, it would help to make visible so many of the activities and efforts that are currently invisible, that are not being valued. And with that, so here is where I think Crefal could actually play a very critical role. There is something very unique about this organization, both in terms of its remit, its historical experiences, its networks, its knowledge of the different contexts in Latin American countries and the Caribbean. Here, Crefal could be a wonderful, let's say, a kind of a experimental laboratory for generating this kind of comprehensive wiki of ALE, of adult learning in ALE, for Latin America, which could then also be an exemplar that could be seen and perhaps experiences and lessons learned from for other regions in the world. So I would challenge Crefal at this very interesting point in its history, institutional history, to consider trying to make visible the very important activities that are ongoing in all the Latin American countries with respect to adult education and lifelong learning, again in the broadest sense, and trying to figure out how you can help both yourselves and the rest of the world to better see the kinds of lifelong learning opportunities that exist. And with that, I would thank you.